Hey guys, Gijoe here, and welcome back to my bunker here in Atlanta, Georgia. Today's video is actually the first video of a two-part series dealing with the victory points for Siredblood's Bloodbath rules. As you may or may not know, we recently finished a YouTube Wars where we were using the Bloodbath rules, and we have noticed that some people had some questions on our YouTube channels regarding the victory points and how to win the game and those kinds of things. So, and since we do have another YouTube Wars game starting up here in about 3 weeks on February 1st, I thought this would be an opportune time to come to you and hopefully clear up any questions that maybe some of you have had regarding the victory points and how a victory is declared either way for the Axis or the Allies. So this will be a two-part series, and the first part will be this video, and we will first deal with the different victory cities that the Axis can acquire to get to those point totals that are needed, as well as we will deal with some of the other territories and regions of the map that the Axis can acquire to also help towards their win total. That'll be this first video here. The second video will be the victory points that the Axis can acquire on the Pacific side of the map. Okay, so this first video, like I said, is the victory cities in general, as well as the Europe victory points. And then video 2 will be the Pacific victory points. And my intention is to go into a little bit greater detail on the victory points, just so everybody understands what they are, where they are, and some of the challenges that might happen in acquiring the victory points for the Axis, okay? So without further ado, let's sit back and I hope you enjoy. And the first thing coming up will be the different victory cities that the Axis need to obtain. Okay guys, so let's talk first about the victory cities and how they pertain to Sired's Bloodbath rules, okay? So what we have here is we have a card. This is the Axis victory card. And as you can see, the first thing you'll see across the top is you see 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now these are the amount of the number of rounds to be played. So what you would do is you would simply determine how many rounds you want to play. Now typically the number is 8. That's what we played here the other night, and that's what we played at the tournament. So what this means is, if you choose to play 8 rounds, then the Axis would need to have combined points of 12 victory points in order to have a victory. Now, there is no scorecard for the Allies because the Allies do not have to get points. All they have to do is keep the Axis from getting 12. Now, that sounds easy, but it's not easy for the Axis to get 12, and it's not easy to stop the Axis from getting 12 points. So let's first talk about the victory cities. That's what this video is about here. So as you can see on this card, you have 5 victory cities that are in green. Of course, Tokyo, Berlin, and Rome, and then Warsaw and Shanghai. Those are the cities that the Axis start the game with. So they start the game with 5. The yellow ones, Paris, Hong Kong, and Philippines, those are the points, or the victory cities rather, that typically fall next. So Paris is always the first one to fall in the G1, so that would bring the Axis to 6. And then of course you have Hong Kong and Philippines that tend to fall anywhere between the first and third rounds, usually. So it is not difficult for the Axis to get up to 8 victory points at all by the third or fourth round at the latest. Question is, how do they get from 8 points to 12 points? And they can do that by a combination of several different things. The first thing is they can choose to take some more victory cities, and these are the typical out-of-box victory cities, or they can try to get some of these territories or zones on the map down here, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So as you can see, we have Egypt, London, Moscow, Sydney, Stalingrad, Calcutta, Leningrad, and Honolulu. Now, if we look at the map, there are a few victory cities that are not listed on this card. For instance, you'll notice that San Francisco is not listed on this card. That is not an accident. That was a purposeful omission. If we look over here, we also do not have Washington, D.C. listed, nor do we have Ottawa, okay? And the reason, according to Siredblood, is Ottawa and San Francisco were not, they're not typically taken in a typical game. That's not usually a move that the Axis make. Also, it's not very historic. And so those are not victory points. So if you go for those, you're not going to get a point. Now, it might be strategic in getting to another goal you have, such as Washington, D.C., but you would not get a victory point by taking Ottawa or San Francisco. Now, Washington, D.C. is also not on this map, or on this card, rather. However, Washington, D.C., according to Sireblood, if the Axis take Washington, D.C., the game is automatically over. Okay? So that's why it's not on the card. So you definitely want to make sure, USA, that you're being careful there, that, you know, if the Germans or Italians, however, end up down in the Strait of Gibraltar, you know, they're one move from the eastern United States. So you just want to always beware of where the German or Italian Navy is, so that you don't lose DC, because the game will be over immediately. Now, there are a couple of other scenarios, and that is Berlin. Now, Berlin is a victory city. However, if the Allies take Berlin, the game is not over immediately. However, if the Allies take Berlin, that means the Axis would have to take Berlin back by the end of Germany's next turn, or the game is over. So, for instance, the Soviet Union is second in the order of play. So if the Soviet Union takes Germany, then by the time you go through the rest of the round, all the way down to France, and then back to Germany, if Germany does not take Berlin back, then the game is over. It doesn't matter if it's the third, fourth, fifth round, okay? And the same scenario applies to Tokyo. If the Allies, which would typically be the United States, if they take over Tokyo, then that means Japan would have to take, or Japan or an Axis power, which would typically be Japan, would have to take Tokyo back by the end of their next turn. Otherwise, the game is automatically over, and it doesn't matter what round it is, okay? So that is basically, very simple, what is going on here with the victory cities. Okay, guys, so let's now talk about the Axis victory points that are on the Europe side of the map. So if we look at our Axis victory point card here, the first one we see right here is Europe oil. Now it says that you need Iraq, Persia, and this is southwest Persia. That should be northwest Persia, and the Caucasus. So if I lay these little markers out here, so we have Iraq, we have Persia, we have northwest Persia, and then of course the Caucasus. Now, seems simple enough. However, of course, in getting this point, or in order to get this point, you know, you have to be, obviously, you know, you're not far from Calcutta here. So, you know, a strong India presence could definitely affect this. Plus, typically, I know that sometimes the UK will build some type of industrial complex in this area, so you have to deal with that as well. In Sireblood's rules, as you see here, Egypt is a 3, which means you can place a major industrial complex here if UK so chooses, so which is only 2 moves away from this. And of course, then you're dealing with Ukraine, Stalingrad industrial complex, whatever. So, so that point is not as easy. Once again, not as easy to get as one would think. So, and so that's that point. Now let's talk about the next point for Europe, or in the Europe side of the map. The Atlantic Wall. Now here it says 4 ground units in each territory of Norway, Denmark, Normandy, and Holland. So, All right, guys, so here we are looking at the Atlantic Wall. Now, what I did was I went ahead and put out some different land units on the 4 territories that you need to build the Atlantic Wall. Of course, you have Normandy, you have Holland, you have Denmark, and then you have Norway. Now, as the card says, you have to have 4 land units. So I have different combinations. Of course, you can do infantry and armor tanks. Anti-aircraft guns would count. So you can use an anti-aircraft gun as one of the units. Of course, mechanized infantry and artillery as well. So any combination of 4 ground units will suffice to get the Atlantic Wall point. And it can be a combination of different Axis partners. So for instance, if Italy wanted to rail or bring units up into here, say, infantry or even some other AAAs, that would count as well. So once again, this point seems easy enough to get, and quite frankly, it is not difficult for Germany in the last couple rounds with all their income, assuming everything's going okay in Russia and Russia's not beating on the door of Berlin. It's not that difficult for Germany to throw 4 units, especially with the aid of Italy to the south, on the Atlantic Wall. That's not the challenge. The challenge is to hold it to the end of the 8th round, because something to keep in mind, it means that the Allies do not have to take control of any of these territories. All they have to do is keep 4 units from being on one of these territories. So for instance, in round 8, if the United States or United Kingdom have a whole bunch of Navy, the possibility of an amphibious assault, or if they have a lot of Air Force over here, they could, and they might be willing to risk and sacrifice their Navy as well as their Air Force just to simply try to take one of these pieces off. So in the final battle, if the United Kingdom or United States or whomever attacks Norway and knocks off one piece, well, of course you wouldn't lose a tank, you'd lose an infantry first. So that, even though there are 3 units on there, even though the United States or any of its allies do not have the forces to take Norway, just by knocking off one piece keeps that Atlantic Wall point from going to the Axis. So oftentimes, of course this all depends on how the board is looking over here, but oftentimes Germany and its allies are going to have to put more than 4 units here, because they're going to have to be willing to take any type of attack and absorb any hits that they need to where even after the battle, they still have 4 pieces remaining on each one of these territories. So a lot of times a move might be, Germany on the very end of their turn, if everything else, assuming everything else is going well, other places, they bring all their Air Force in and they just start landing their Air Force here so that the Air Force can defend at high numbers, defend at 4 or 3 or 4. And then strangely enough, the Air Force would absorb the hits. That way the land units could stay on land to get the Atlantic Wall point. So something to think about on the Atlantic Wall point for the Europe side of the map. Okay, so let's talk about the next point on the Axis victory card. So we have the Mediterranean. It says no Allied territories in sea zones 95 through 99. So if we zoom in here, let me zoom in here a little bit, sorry. So obviously, sea zones 95, this is sea zone 95. So let me put a marker there, that's sea zone 95. This is sea zone 96. This is sea zone 97. This is sea zone 98, and then sea zone 99. Now that doesn't mean there can't be warships there. That means there are no Allied territories. Now, at the start of the game, there are only 2 territories in those sea zones, and that is Cyprus, and that is Malta. Okay? So, assuming that Sardinia, Sicily, and Crete do not fall into Allied hands, that means all the Axis would have to do is take Malta and Cyprus. If they take Malta and Cyprus, then they would get that point. However, if UK, for instance, if UK comes in, and or the United States, you know, any one of their allies, if they come in and they take, let's say they take Sicily, then Italy would have to come in, or Germany, somebody, would have to come in and take Sicily back from the Allies, and then, of course, get Malta and Cyprus. So it's really only 2 additional territories, or islands, I guess you could say, 2 additional than what Italy starts with on the opening set. So that is the Mediterranean point. Now, none of these other territories are involved in the Mediterranean point. That will be a different point, which we'll talk about here in a second. Greece is, again, not on this point. It's only Sardinia, Sicily, Malta, and Cyprus. And, of course, Crete. If the Allies activate Crete, it does say pro-Allies, then, of course, Crete will have to be taken by the Axis. Okay? So the fact that that says pro-Allies, it does not have to be taken by the Axis unless it is activated by the Allies first. Okay? All right, so that is the Mediterranean point. Now, let's talk about Africa. Let's talk about New Rome, since we're up in this area, and then we'll go backwards here. So New Rome says all of North Africa plus Greece and Crete. Okay? So obviously that would be all of North Africa. So that means the Axis control Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and of course their original Libya and Tobruk. And then they'd have to control Alexandria and Egypt as well. And of course, go ahead and mark this, because they would already have that, since Italy opens up the game with that. Let me back away a little bit here so you can see. Yeah. So all of North Africa plus Greece plus Crete. Okay, so the Axis would have to battle these 4 infantry units here in Greece, and then they would have to somehow get to Crete via transport. Okay? So that right there, those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, those 9 territories plus or 8 territories plus an island would constitute the New Rome point for the Axis. Okay, so as you can see, Italy has the opportunity to get 2 points for the Axis, and of course, if you're taking Egypt, this is one of those dual points. If the Axis take Egypt, you get 1 point for Cairo, right, for Victory City. And then if you get all of these territories as well, that would be an additional point. So that's a potential 2 points sitting right there, not including the Mediterranean point, which we just discussed. Okay? And, all right, so let's talk now about, I think this is going to be the last point for the Axis in the Europe side of the map. And that is right here. It says the Africa Horn. The Africa Horn is Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, and both British and Italian Somaliland. So taking these points off the board, you have Sudan, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, you have Kenya, you have Ethiopia, and then you have Italy, or Italian Somaliland, and British Somaliland. Okay, so that was, you know, one of the objectives during World War II for the Italians. So that is why that is a victory point for the Axis. Now, again, that seems easy enough, but with Cairo sitting right here, plus you have an industrial complex, Union of South Africa for the Brits, and since they can rail 3, 1, 2, 3, plus Britain starts with a contingency force right here, plus their navy that comes from Calcutta. I mean, that makes this point a lot more difficult than it seems. So that is essentially, let me double check here, make sure I've covered everything. Europe oil, we talked about that. Atlantic Wall, talked about that. Resources, I think I mentioned this on the Pacific video, but I'll go ahead and mention this again. But resources would involve part of Europe, part of the Pacific map. So you have Ukraine, Then, of course, the Urals up here, and then way off to the east, Siberia. Okay, so obviously Japan would have to help out and assist in getting this point off to the side. So, again, seems easy enough, but Ukraine is right here. You've got industrial complex there, and so these points are a lot easier than they seem. Okay, so that would be it. So those are the points for the Europe side of the map.